here, but you get the general idea. There are different types of innovation and different relationships to outcomes. So, and this is not universal, it's in one of the editions of the book, I think the last 2 or 3, and we keep adding to it and extending it. So the obvious one is novelty, doing something different, the differentiation. Okay, and that's things like product and service development. Terribly important. Process, we keep banging on about. Under-researched, underutilised, but the research that's there tells us that it's a very powerful thing compared with product innovation. So process, a big deal. Complexity is more about how you put it all together. Yeah, because sometimes you reverse engineer the competitor's products and you literally do not know how they manufacture it. You don't know who the suppliers are, how certain components are manufactured or designed. So it's the ability to put things together in some coherent way, and that could be products and services. It could be about intellectual property. It rarely is only about intellectual property, and we'll spend a whole session on that later in the module. Okay? On its own, things like copyright and patents, things like that, on their own, generally don't create a lot of innovation, but in combination with other things can be very powerful, as we'll see. So it follows that trend where one type, if you like, of advantage is not sufficient. It's 2 or 3 interacting. But it is part of the management repertoire. Product extension, market extension, that sort of, if you like, positioning innovation, to use that term. Yeah, so moving into whole, either uncontested markets, new markets, segment creation, or into other people's markets with new offerings. And that's different to product development. And timing, which we haven't spoken about much today, but we'll come back to that later in the module. Timing's terribly important, and it's not simply about being first to market. The studies suggest that being first to market, assuming you can, because most companies can't, is not always a smart thing to do. And you need to understand the conditions. Okay, so we'll look at the conditions where it makes sense, if you're able to be early to the market, and we'll also look at the conditions where it doesn't make sense. Okay, so it's not a universally good idea, but certainly time in, not necessarily time to market, is critically important. Particularly when you have systematic, or systemic is a better word, isn't it? Systemic innovations, you know, things need to work together. And that's what you find, is often innovations emerge because a piece of the puzzle suddenly becomes technically viable, or in terms of price or performance, possible to offer. Yeah? And that's the last piece of the puzzle, and then something new and novel can be offered. So time is terribly important. And in terms of timing, you know, the sort of anecdotal thing is, you know, if you're first to market, you get this reputation of being first to market, of being innovative and a pioneer. So what? I mean, what are the benefits of getting a reputation of being a pioneer? You could build loyalty, at least amongst the segment that values new and novel things. So certainly, sometimes it's very big, sometimes it's very small, but certainly if it's a big enough segment, then that's a great thing. You get that reputation. Any other benefits? You could get more customers, but it depends how big that segment is, but it certainly could be that.
I think it's good to get funding. Like with Elon Musk, a lot of the reason he gets the money he gets, of course, is Elon Musk. So he can sort of get more.
That's the main reason, yeah. It's voodoo, I think, is what it is. But you're certainly right. Yeah, it could be early on you may get funding, or conversely you may be able to lock in suppliers, or you may be able to have intellectual property to appropriate the technologies. These things are rarer than you might think, but certainly there's reputational gain in the sense of you may get a more loyal cohort, but it depends how big that is. You can also do things like premium price. You know, people would generally bear a premium, even on a relatively modest product, if the maker has a brand or name that suggests it's a pioneer. Not a pioneer as in a company pioneer, but pioneer as in a first mover, yeah. So it has some measurable benefits. The other, if you like, arguments for being early to the market is, and that's sort of closer to the Tesla electric vehicle argument and battery argument, is there are a large number of studies that suggest, which is mainly about process innovation again, sort of bang on about this, is experience or learning curves. It basically means the cumulative production volume, although it's also services, drives down unit costs. And basically it's a measurement of learning. Yeah? You debug the process, you redesign the product, so it's easy to manufacture, the feedback from customers, blah, blah, blah. So if you learn effectively, hence the learning curve or experience curve, you drive down unit costs. Okay, it's not about economies of scale, that's a completely separate thing. That's bigger and bigger plants, but you need to be able to get capacity and sell that. That's problematic. But the argument, a bit like Tesla's battery plants and that, is to get there early, to learn quickly and drive down unit costs, so it creates whole new market segments. So you can become, yeah? And if you get that right, it can be quite powerful. If you get it wrong, it can be quite expensive. Third one, which we sort of mentioned, is you can, if you get it right, you can have standards, or you can have intellectual property that might slow others down coming behind you. You can legally or otherwise dominate supply chains, rare materials, for example. Okay, a lot of new products have very rare materials, and you can quietly buy up those supply chains completely legally. And on the other side, distribution networks. It's becoming less so unless it's physical products, but certainly you can tie up distribution networks. And if you get those things right, you can earn what the economists tell temporary monopoly rents or profits. Yeah? So the idea is if you get those things right, some of those things, you can at least temporarily, which could be months or years in some sectors, but how quickly people catch up, you can have bigger margins. Yeah? And that allows you then to, if you reinvest, blah, 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 blah. Yeah? However, we're saying that type of strategy has to work in certain conditions. So where you have complementary products and services, they need to be in place. Yeah? And often something's missing, and so the first and sometimes the second mover doesn't end up with a viable innovation. And the history books are littered with that. So trying to understand, if you like, the early conditions is the prerequisite for that strategy to work. Yeah? And often you find it's the third or fourth mover who actually wins the day. Okay, yeah, let's start rounding up. Okay, a couple of last slides and then I'll hang around for any questions you might have. Okay, some more stylized facts, just summarising I think what we said. It's more than just talking about research and development and patents. You know, a lot of people, even in other modules, will talk a lot about research and patents for two reasons. One, they're mainly about technology. Okay, that's only part of the challenge. And more importantly, they're relatively easy to count because most companies have to publish things on patents and R&D. Doesn't mean they're important. Okay, and they're certainly not sufficient. So we need to go beyond just looking at those sort of things. Partly because there's such a lot of variation at the firm level. Some firms do really well, some firms do consistently poorly. So we need to learn from that. Blah, blah, blah. Generally a positive performance between innovation and things like high value added, market input values, growth and such like. Where's the... Yeah, two things. The penultimate bullets there. Returns from the use of new technology are higher than from its generation. A bit of a clumsy statement. But basically saying often there are technologies out there that you don't have to reinvent. You have to identify, you might want to adapt, you may license them, you may buy them. Yeah, but as we said earlier, often it's a combination of two or three different types of innovation that create that novel offering. So you can still, if you like, acquire, buy, adapt some pieces of that puzzle. So everything doesn't have to be unique. Okay, so a lot of companies put so much emphasis on the generation technology that they never get those other complementary aspects in place. Okay, so figuring out, if you like, what is distinctive and what you can acquire or license is terribly important. We spend a lot of time on that on the module. As I said, depending on the study, most studies suggest that process innovation is several times more important than product innovation. Yeah, it's slightly harder and different to manage, partly because it's harder to identify. Yeah, it's different to product innovation, but it has a very high return. I mean, why do you think process innovation may have such a higher return than product innovation? There's a whole bunch of reasons, but what do you think the primary ones might be?
Cost control.
One is, well, not just cost, but generally, you know, processes are more controllable in the sense, and most of it, not all, because you can have a supply chain, but more of it's internalised. Whereas with a product, particularly business to consumer, you chuck it out there, and then you're at the mercy of your sales, distribution, customer responses, loads of uncertainty. But certainly a lot of process stuff, it's not easy, but it's more controllable, it's more internal. Not all of it, because you work with partners now, but a lot more than you do with product innovation. So one is the issue of control. Another is an issue of imitation, as we suggested earlier. You know, the first time you create a new product, whatever industry you're in, you know, the first 50, 60 of those products will be acquired by your competitors. Not directly, but through agents and other people. And then they will reverse engineer, how do they make it, what it costs, can we do it, what can we learn, who are their suppliers, okay? And it may be months, maybe years before they catch up or emulate, but there will be emulation. Yeah? With processes, you're often not even sure what the processes are, let alone how they work, because they're buried deep within the organisation. Okay? So they're much harder to imitate, much slower to get competition from. And for those two reasons, more management control and harder to imitate, they tend to have a bigger return over a long period. And lastly, management of innovation, independent of innovation, has an additive effect. So putting these things together, orchestrating them, to use the current term, has an additional effect. Yeah? above and beyond the innovations themselves. How much that effect is depends on the study and who you believe, how you measure it. But it has an additive effect. So we're saying bringing these things together, different types of innovation, you know, is more than the sum of the individual parts in that respect. Okay. Last slide doesn't really tell you anything, does it? No, it basically repeats the previous slide. So the implications are more process, less emphasis on generation, more emphasis on combination, yeah, because we're saying that's the way forward. Okay, let's stop there. I'll hang around for about 15 minutes if you want any individual questions on that. As I say, if you then think of things between now and next week, put them on the forum for the module and we'll have a chat online rather than doing it bilaterally by email. Okay, and the recording should be available in 2 or 3 hours depending on when the servers whirl it up there.